Good evening, everyone. I'm Shreya Atre. I am an associate professor in international human rights law and a fellow at Kellogg. It is my greatest pleasure to welcome you all to the second annual Black History Month lecture at Kellogg. For many of us, themes around Black history, Black feminism, decolonization, intersectionality, and anti-racism are not an yearly affair. They rather what occupy us throughout the year. Yet, in a world where this is far from the norm, it is useful to dedicate something like the Black History Month to be able to talk about Britain's Black history and these allied themes. Earlier this month, we inaugurated the immaculately imagined Black Women at Oxford exhibition, curated by our former DPhil student at Kellogg, Urvi Khetan. Urvi is somewhere here, right there. If you've not had a chance to have a look at the exhibition, it's right here, and there's a week left. And I would recommend you do so without much more ado, because the exhibition is revealing. Urvi, thank you so much for another successful year putting up this important exhibition. And now, what could be a better way to following that up than by hearing from the first Black woman to occupy the Jacques Delor Chair of European Union Law at Oxford, Iyiola Solanke. Iyiola, your appointment is historic and gives us so much heart and inspiration. And not only to people of color, but everyone who cares for themes that you have immensely contributed to in your career: social justice, discrimination law, and last but not the least, the theme for today's lecture, European Union law. Since Brexit, it has become more, not less, important to think about the UK's relationship with the European Union, especially from the standpoint of Black history and via the theme of decolonization. And before you get to hear from Iyiola on this, I would like to introduce her to you. As I mentioned, Professor Iyiola Solanke is now the Jacques Delor Chair in the European Union Law at Oxford. She was previously a professor of European Union Law and Social Justice at the University of Leeds Law School and the Dean of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at the university. She's a visiting professor at Wake Forest University School of Law and Harvard University School of Public Health. She's the author of several monographs, including EU law, making anti-racial discrimination law, and my favorite, well, not the subject per se, but or let's say not the title, but the subject of it, Discrimination as Stigma, a Theory of Anti-Discrimination Law. And that too, I highly recommend. Iyiola is an academic bencher at Inner Temple and a judicial member of the Valuation Tribunal of England, the VTE. She founded the Black Female Professors Forum and the Temple Women's Forum North to promote engagement between legal professionals and students in and around Yorkshire. She recently chaired the inquiry into the history of eugenics at UCL and is leading 2 research projects: CoPower, an ESRC-funded project looking into the impact of COVID and practices for well-being and resilience in Black, Asian, and minority ethnic families and communities, and the other project, which is Generation Delta, a REOF-funded project promoting access to PGR study for BAME students, especially BAME women. Iyiola, we are so pleased to welcome you to Oxford and to Kellogg, and thank you for delivering today's lecture, which is co-hosted by Decolonising the Law discussion group at the Faculty of Law. The floor is all yours. You have about 40-45 minutes for the lecture, and that should leave us good 20 minutes for questions from the floor. Please join me in welcoming Iyiola.
Thank you very much, Shreya, for that very warm and generous welcome to Oxford and to the event this evening. It certainly was an unexpected joy and privilege to be appointed the Jacques Delor Professor of European Union Law, and I'm very excited to be here and to be a Fellow of Somerville College. Thank you for all the work that you are doing here in relation to decolonising in the college and in the faculty. It's so important. And thanks to you and to Professor Jonathan Mitchie for organising this event tonight. I'm very much looking forward to sharing these ideas with you all and to hearing your questions and comments afterwards. It's very much a work in progress, so feel free to tell me exactly what you think, other than that you think it's all rubbish, of course. Okay, so this project really began when I was talking to a friend about my work, and I mentioned, I want to start thinking about decolonising European Union law. I do discrimination work comparatively in the European Union, but I'm really, I'm playing with this idea of decolonising European Union law. And he replied, sounds good, but what does that mean exactly? And I thought, okay. So I gave an off-the-cuff answer, and then I thought, actually, that's quite a good question. And my inner voice said, in a very, are there any fans of Gavin and Stacey here? In a very Nessa-esque way, fair question. And an important one. So when I was invited to speak in Copenhagen at a conference on colonialism and the European Union legal order, I decided to take that as a chance to reflect upon this question. What does decolonising European Union law mean exactly? And if we wanted to take decolonising of European Union law seriously, why would we do it? And thirdly, if we decided it was a worthwhile activity, how would we go about it? So please allow me now to share my ideas with you in the next 30 or 40 minutes or so. And I thought it would help to begin with a short explanation of the word decolonisation. And then I'll set out what I see as the answers to these questions. So what is the purpose? Why is it important? And then what can we think of as principles and practices that should accompany this purpose if we decide that it is, if we agree that it is important? So the ideas that I'm going to share over the next few minutes are informed by my work over the past few years in European Union law, in discrimination law, in diversity studies, critical stigma studies, in post-colonial studies, critical race feminism, and critical race theory. So it really is a hodgepodge, a melee, if you like, of all of the bits of work that I've done over the past years, and I'm trying to put it all together into this one project, Decolonising European Union Law. So in a way, it's like the start of every PhD project. You want to do everything. And I'm sure that over the next few months, I'll whittle it down to become something that's more focused. So to start then with decolonisation in general. So in everyday use, decolonisation refers to the explicit end of political and military rule by invaders, their departure from a captured territory, and the return of government to the colonised peoples. However, in education, decolonisation refers to a process in which we rethink, reframe, and reconstruct things such as the curricula and research that preserve the Europe-centred colonial lens. So the concept in education advocates for a fundamental examination and reconsideration of norms embedded as tradition, norms of access and entrance, norms of knowledge production and dissemination, of teaching and assessment, of scholarship and authorship, of recognition and reward. As I said, it's broad. It refers to a questioning of stories of victory, stories that silence the realities of oppression with the aim to decentralise imperialist ways of seeing. So decolonisation is therefore an active process, which includes restoring visibility to untold his and her stories, and also reframing the gaze to change ways of seeing. I think of decolonisation as being as powerful as a Serena Williams return, one of my sheroes. It is speaking back, as described by bell hooks, and returning the gaze, as discussed by Spivak, as well as intentionally redirecting both the voice and the gaze. So that's one of the amazing things about the Serena Williams serve. It doesn't matter how powerful it comes, from which direction, she takes control of that ball and sends it back in the way that she wants it to go. So this idea of decolonisation, the word is not an empty phrase, but I think it could introduce an exciting new methodology and a powerful agenda for exploration of colonialism in the EU legal order. And as described by the organisers of the conference in Denmark, it's not just a historical exercise, but one that could provide an important starting point for examinations of European Union law and the European legal order of today. So as I go through what I think of as the purpose, the principles and the practice of decolonisation, I'm really thinking of these as the starting point. And I'm really trying to think about what could happen if we took decolonisation as the starting point for our interaction with European Union law. What would this mean in relation to teaching and research in the various fields of EU law and the European Union legal order? So my talk is an invitation to play with this idea of decolonisation and think about how it could open up the world of European integration and European Union law to a new generation of scholars and audiences. So I'll now discuss this, starting with purpose. So I think there are three parts to the purpose of decolonisation of EU law: excavation, dissemination, and correction. Starting with excavation, this is what we really did at the conference in Copenhagen. Presenters from different European countries and from different disciplines highlighted the imprint of colonialism and its various iterations, discussing the ways in which colonialism had shaped first the EU legal order, secondly individual experiences, and thirdly societies that were subjected to European Union law. And of course, these were societies not only in the European Union itself, but also around the world in the colonised territories. The search was for the footprints of colonisation and European integration. And there was no denying by anybody at that conference that colonialism had left its imprint on Europe and its peoples, but also that colonialism had left its imprint on the peoples of those colonised lands, whether they are resident in those formerly colonised territories or in Europe. So one of the questions that I asked myself was, do we see this imprint in policies concerning immigration and asylum? In relation to talk of dreams in the UK of sending asylum seekers to Rwanda? Or in relation to practices in the Mediterranean, preventing boats bearing refugees from reaching land? Arguably, we could say, these policies stem from a certain way of seeing peoples from previously colonised countries. But that's just my assertion. If there is this imprint in these policies, then this can only really be understood once it is excavated. So like an archaeological find, just as the curation of this excellent exhibition, like an archaeologist, there has to be very careful in the sense of care being taken and much attention to detail being played. being paid, the work needs to be conducted carefully and purposefully. And this is as important for those of us in Europe as it is for those elsewhere in the world. So this excavation should include reflections on how, for example, colonialism has shaped consciousness. How did Europe use the colonized lands to create a new self-understanding that became the basis for the foundations of the European Union legal order? Or how did colonialism shape relationships between individuals and institutions within the European legal order? And thirdly, how did the colonial period affect interpersonal relationships between individuals in the European Union legal order? So if we were to reflect upon these things, this would result in a broadening of the story that we tell about the evolution of European integration and European Union law, as well as who tells these stories. So the second part of this category of purpose is dissemination. The second purpose has to be to disseminate knowledge on the excavation of these imprints. So in relation to European Union law, this might require those of us who teach the topic to do something differently. Perhaps we would need to review the topics covered in the European Union canon, especially in relation to the history and evolution of European integration. How do we teach these? Which questions do we ask? The role of former colonies would not just be studied and researched as part of external affairs, but would be integral to understanding the foundations of the European Union itself. And then correction. So the final purpose of decolonising European Union law has to be correction of the negative imprints of colonialism. Decolonisation is, for me, not just an intellectual exercise, but has important practical applications for social justice. So as you can see in this image here, the purpose of correction is to inform action. Excavation is therefore important because it creates a basis for correction. How might the European approach to immigration or policing change, for example, if the facts of European colonisation were more widely known? In relation to teaching European Union law, correction doesn't mean expanding an already full curriculum, but thinking about where we draw examples from to illustrate core principles. For example, why not use cases concerning asylum and immigration to illustrate direct effect? Or Europol and Frontex as examples in discussions of competences and conferral, or in relation to the infringements procedures and respects for human rights. So that's all I want to say about the purpose, and I'll now move on to principles. So what principles could support these three purposes? I would suggest that there are three: intentionality, which I've already mentioned, multilateralism, and democracy. So intentionality, this requires sensitivity to dominant discourses and the influence of dominant groups in what and who we research. Decolonisation should be approached as a reminder that intellectual activity requires vigilance and care. When we think about decolonisation, we should in particular be intentional about reflecting upon our assumptions, bearing in mind that even our assumptions about rationality derive from a literature that developed at a particular time and a particular place. In relation to multilateralism, the boundaries of the colonial imprint are very hard to ascertain. There really is no single location. Colonization was a global endeavour that spanned continents and crossed countries. So decolonization of necessity must follow that same path. It requires the acknowledgement of multiple levels and multiple places. And this might apply especially to a multi-level entity such as the European Union. Decolonising European Union law must be cross-continental, transnational, and intranational to understand how it affects the lives of those still present in the formerly colonised territories, as well as those from these territories present in Europe, be it as refugees and asylum seekers, as tourists, as entrepreneurs, or even as citizens. In relation to democracy, colonisation was inherently anti-democratic. It took away all rights from those who were colonised. As I have written elsewhere, decolonisation in education is important because education is inextricably linked to democracy and democratic institutions. Exclusion in the context of higher education, from research and scholarship to the scholars themselves, results in homogeneous social thinking and social institutions, which all too easily become hosts of practices and policies that undermine democracy. So pursuit of the decolonisation agenda could therefore be seen as key to a stronger European democracy. And I would argue that decolonising European Union law is therefore an opportunity to reinvigorate the study of democracy and how this underpins anti-discrimination and equality. This principle of democracy acts as a reminder that decolonisation is part of a larger agenda. It is ultimately about social justice and building a strong and intentionally anti-discriminatory democracy in Europe. This is important to stress, especially given recent challenges to democracy in various locations around the world. So moving to my last category, practice. I would suggest that there are 4 core areas of practice. Firstly, decolonisation must be attentive to identifying a mission, the voids and the silences in European Union law, so as to create inclusive narratives and narrators. In addition, it should be empirical, systemic, and collaborative. So to start with a mission. We should aim to become sensitive to who is missing from the stories that we tell about European integration and European Union law. Where, for example, are the colonial territories and their contribution to rebuilding Europe after World War II in the run-up to the Treaty of Paris? What attention was given to the colonies during the period of the signing of the Treaty of Rome? Prior to the publication of my textbook in European Union Law, quick plug, CUP 2022, there was only one European Union Law textbook by Delor that mentioned the relations of the European Economic Community in the early 1950s to former colonised territories. Now, colonies were a reality for 5 of the founding member states. France still had possessions in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. Belgium still ruled over Zaire and held trusteeship of Rwanda. The Netherlands maintained dependencies in the Pacific, Suriname, and in the Caribbean, Aruba. And Italy still held its mandate over Somalia. Only Germany had no colonial connections anywhere in the world, having reluctantly relinquished control over its territories as part of the post-World War II settlement at Versailles. Now, these colonised countries were integrated into the Treaty of Rome under Articles 131 to 36, which set out the idea of associationism as a method to manage relationships between the EEC in Brussels with these countries. However, there were no representatives from these countries, who sat around those negotiation tables in Rome. Also missing is information on the contributions made by people from colonized countries to rebuild in Europe. For example, Algerians in France, or those from the Caribbean currently trying to rebuild their lives after the Windrush scandal, who served the UK as personnel in the armed forces, and especially during the COVID pandemic as key workers in hospitals and in local transport. Their living and working experiences are nowhere reflected in European Union studies or European Union law. This failure of legal scholarship to pay attention to the role of Europe's colonial history in Europe's present therefore has significant consequences for knowledge production in Europe. So my argument is that study and omission will enable European Union law to become more inclusive and could stimulate reflection on the demographics of European Union law. What actions, interventions, and scholarship is recognised, and how does this influence the distribution of rewards, studentships, research grants, visitorships, posts, and even the naming of chairs? When will we have, for example, the Claude Moraes Chair in European Union law, or indeed the Olivet Otele Chair of European History? And Claude Moraes was the first black member of the European Parliament, who of course came from the UK, and Olivet Otele is the first professor of history in this country, the first black female professor of history in this country. So reducing racial homogeneity is urgently needed in relation to teaching, management and leadership in the European Union institutions and in European Union law. As I have asked in the past, where are the black professors in Europe? Or more specifically, where are the black professors in European Union law? Present company accepted, of course. The field has done an abysmal job in attracting black Europeans. Consequently, there are less than a handful of us black scholars working in this area. This absence of a critical mass of black scholars facilitates attacks on theories prioritising research into black lives. French academics faced little opposition when in November 2020 they decried critical race theory as contributing to the killing of a schoolteacher. So such homogeneity is bad for the European Union and bad for European Union law. To adapt a statement made by Lady Brenda Hale, former president of the UK Supreme Court, European Union law, the European Union legal profession, and the European Union courts are there to serve the whole population, not just a small section of it. They should be as reflective of that population as it is possible to be. So moving on to the second aspect of practice, empirical studies. Excavation and correction require empirical investigation, and there is much scope for this. For example, case law from the European Court of Human Rights and studies by the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights indicate that racial harassment and violence by the police is commonplace across the European Union. But as far as I'm aware, there is no academic empirical research drilling into this phenomenon. Thus, this would entail looking into the data to interrogate, for example, deaths in police custody across the European Union of healthy young black men and women, such as Uri Jallo and Christy Schwundeck in Germany, or Mohammed Hassan in Wales during COVID. Systemic approaches. I think this is important to stress because colonialism was a system. Therefore, decolonisation must similarly focus on systems. The purpose is not to highlight individual action and behaviours, but structures, institutions, and processes. This applies to both private as well as public law. There are opportunities for private law scholars, such as those interested in company law. For example, the legal competence in Article 19 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union has been used to develop diversity charters across the European Union member states. These diversity charters are used to promote and support best practices in diversity management in many private and some public organisations. They are adopted voluntarily by businesses in the member states, working in collaboration with the national ministries. To date, there are 26 diversity charters spanning the breadth of prohibitions against discrimination listed in Article 19 of the treaty. It's noteworthy that these diversity charters have proliferated in countries that have only recently adopted laws prohibiting discrimination beyond gender. Little is known about these diversity charters and their impact on improving living and working conditions for Black Europeans. Research on these would therefore make an important contribution to European Union law and to European Union democracy. So my final aspect in relation to practice is co-production. In thinking about co-production as a practice, we need to think in terms of multiple disciplines. Decolonising European Union law is of necessity multidisciplinary. It is not just a task for European Union lawyers, but could be undertaken in collaboration with, for example, historians, sociologists, and political scientists. This idea of co-production can also be linked to the pro-democracy principle. Integral to democracy is participation, and this is increasingly important in relation to research cultures. Excavating and correcting the imprints of colonialism in European Union law should thus be conducted together with those from populations with direct biographical links to countries that were colonised. In the absence of such co-production, decolonising European Union law merely becomes a guise for neo-colonialism. So, to conclude, as I said at the start, decolonisation of European Union law is a broad project. It's a way to move away, it's a way of thinking, it's a way to move away from a way of thinking that is Eurocentric and privileges this way of seeing above experiences and perspectives from other parts of the world. It is an approach that seeks to move legal education in this field towards a reframing and a reconstructing of questions and methods that recognises and respects different experiences. Decolonisation goes further than diversification, because diversity can still exist within a Western bias. Decolonisation attempts to go further and deeper in challenging the institutional hierarchy and monopoly on knowledge. So it is a shift. Now, if European Union law even slightly shifts its vision in this way, it will, as put by Meiji, shake off its commitment to colonial ways of thinking so that decoloniality in all its aspects becomes embedded in European Union law. Excavation, I argue, will result in the practice of questioning normative content and assumptions of European Union legal studies, the production of themes and priorities, the interest reflected in topics and assessments, as well as an analysis of those whose research is taught and whose work is published. Excavation, dissemination, and correction must be pursued through co-production, a systemic focus on omission and empirical work. This work should be informed by the principles of intentionality, multilateralism, and democracy. If we pursue this project, thought must be given as to how we then sustain it as an effective practice in the long term. So creating opportunities for teaching and research related to decolonising will enrich European Union legal studies intellectually, as well as build future capacity for faculty diversity in the field. Because as the American Bar Association argues, diversity, both cognitive and cultural, often leads to better questions, better analyses, better solutions, and better processes. A broad range of views can discover better answers for our complex and intersectional world, and potentially produce new solutions. Finally, I think that reflection on decolonisation could help us to reflect upon the broader question of what legal education is for, and who the legal profession needs to be trained in to create an accessible and sustainable justice system that supports and strengthens social justice in a multicultural democracy. Thank you all for listening so patiently.
Thank you so much, Iyiola, for an extremely rich and offbeat lecture for lawyers, which we desperately need. So from the offbeat lecture, the aim is here to make it central and as much a part of the discourse. So thank you so much for centralizing a thought which we really grapple with, but understand far less of than we should. Thank you. We have plenty of time for questions. So the way we'll probably roll is that you want to catch my eye and I'll identify you and we'll pass the mic to you and we'll probably take a question at a time since we have plenty of time, unless you want to catch my eye now and I have a sense that there'll be more questions and we'll be able to take so before we start with I'm going to abuse my privilege as the chair and ask one of my own and then perhaps kick off from questions from the floor. Iyiola, I was wondering, do you think it's harder or it's easier to decolonize European Union law than constitutional or municipal or domestic laws, given the fact that the European Union as an entity didn't colonize per se? So I'm wondering how easy might it be to have a sense of the European Union colonization in order for there to be decolonization. And I'm wondering specifically in terms of how do we, I think it can be done, but I'm just thinking if we could hear from you about the dynamics of how do we really factor in the context of the multiple colonizations which might be reflected in European Union law. So I think far from thinking that actually because the European Union as an entity didn't colonize per se in the traditional sense that, of course, there's no colonization. I'm making the argument, but because there might be the sum of the individual colonization parts might be reflected in European Union, which might be so much more than what we think. And that task of decolonization, European Union law, how would that task transpire, which gives space to understanding the specificities of different contexts of colonization? So I'm thinking, what would it mean to reflect on how France's view of Senegal versus Algeria reflects in what it does in respect of European Union law? Or am I in the wrong direction? Are we not meant to go this narrow? Or is there a broader, only European Union as an entity theory which is needed in order for us to decolonize?
Easy questions to start with. Thank you.
Easy for you.
So that is a very good question. And the answer is that I think it has to be both. Because, as you said, the European Union per se wasn't a colonizing entity. It kind of inherited the colonial relationships from the member states. So there has to be action within those member states. But the focus is the European Union. So it's looking at, as you said, how France, for example, reorganized the dynamics of its relations with its colonies and incorporated those into the European Union. or how migrant workers from Algeria were incorporated into the European Union, either when they were still working in Algeria or when they travelled to France. So it has to be a bit of both. And that makes it, I don't know if it makes it harder or easier, but it certainly makes it more exciting. There is also scope, of course, for tackling the issue from the European level. And that is perhaps a bit easier because there you are going to, for example, to one of the Directorate Generals in the Commission, or you're going to the Court of Justice. And there is perhaps some autonomy in those institutions to start to address the issues themselves. So it's a bit of both. And I think both aspects are as important as the other.
Thank you. There's a question at the back. It'd be great if people could introduce themselves before they ask their question. Thank you.
Okay, hi. Thank you so much. That was such a great presentation. I'm Genevieve Smith. I'm a DPhil student here at Kellogg. My work has to do with post-colonial studies and decolonization, so really interesting. I was curious, I'm American, and in a couple of days, the Supreme Court in the United States will be assessing cases related to affirmative action in the US. And of course, there's also the context related to legal battles related to changing or updating education systems to have more accurate histories that reflect racism in the US and the battles that are happening in the US regarding that. And so I'm curious, how do we balance efforts for decolonization amongst increasing polarization and this really harmful and destructive narrative of reverse discrimination? And what are some thoughts around that? Really appreciate it. And any lessons for Iyiola from the American context, perhaps?
Thank you. Another easy question. So lessons from European Union law for the American context? I don't think there'll be any. And this actually, there was something I forgot to say in answer to your question, which is that part of the challenge of the European Union is that in the majority of the other member states, even discussing race is taboo. And those who do try to raise the issue of racism and problematize racism are themselves described as racists. So and that is transferred to the European Union level. So the European Union really just reflects the situation that exists within the member states. So in relation to lessons from the European Union for America, I'm afraid I don't think there will be any. In terms of the balancing, I think that has to come from precisely what is happening in the American context today, from ensuring that the voices in favour of affirmative action, the voices that can explain why affirmative action is necessary and positive, continue to be heard. And the mere fact that they can raise their voices is important because, as I've said, there are many places in Europe where that still is not the case. And that's why we see in many countries the resurgence of the far right. I mentioned the example in France where the French academics decided that critical race theory was to blame for the horrific murder of a school teacher. And there was no space to discuss and debate that assertion. Firstly, because as I said, discussing race is taboo, but secondly, because there just wasn't a critical mass of scholars who could do that. So it was a sad situation. Thankfully, we're not there yet here. We can still talk about race and racism in this country. But I think for the most part, we discrimination lawyers here in the UK think of ourselves as still learning from the American experience rather than the reverse.
This gentleman at the back.
Thank you very much indeed for excellent presentation. Great
Thank you.
interest, those of us who see the European Union as an experiment, an evolving experiment in democracy, and who wish that this country had not left the European Union and hope that someday we may be back at part of Europe. I wonder, since your purpose in relation to the European Union must also be a purpose in relation to this country's laws, I wonder if I could come a little off piece and ask where in your narrative you would situate yesterday's appointment by Prime Minister of Colour, of a Home Secretary, a woman of colour, who wishes to withdraw the UK from the European Convention on Human Rights, who wishes to make wholesale, unscrutinised repeal of EU rights incorporated into UK law, who wishes to deport small boat migrants to a country where they do not wish to be.
And dreams of such, in fact.
And dreams and obsesses of such, indeed. And who appears not to pay little regard to ministerial regulations. Does the holding of such views by people of colour at the heart of this country's government make?
Wow. What can I say? No. As I said, it's very interesting because I had this conversation with a friend prior to the appointment of Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister yesterday, and that is a very important moment. But likewise, the appointment of Kwasi Kwarteng as, I think, the first Black Chancellor was also a very important moment. But we have to understand that diversity is not just about morphology. Diversity is, of course, about morphology, it's about culture, but it's also about cognition. And I think if there's one thing that is perhaps positive about these recent appointments is that it does demonstrate very clearly that Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities are not homogenous. And I think that's something that we've been grappling with for a few years as we debate the use of the phrase BAME. But if there's anything that, if there is any way in which it is helpful to have now such a diverse cabinet, it is in that sense. In a way, it manifests that there is diversity amongst Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities. Whether it helps my project in any way?
Question in front and then.
Hi, Professor Solanke. Thank you very much for the really eye-opening talk. To build on your points about the taboos, I was wondering whether I could ask about how do you think academia should respond to quite hardline denialist attitudes, sometimes citing quite precisely as well. For example, sometimes the EU politicians will argue that actually the EU is a really democratic and open institution because it was founded to combat fascism and to make sure that fascism didn't happen again, and therefore is actually really against racism, and also perhaps on a national level as well. For example, German politicians might argue German constitutional law was founded after the atrocities of the Third Reich. And for example, the basic law, the constitutional code, is actually really anti-racial discrimination already. And just to introduce myself, as requested, I'm Chen. I'm an undergrad studying law with German law. I just started studying EU law.
And has just returned from a year abroad in Bonn. That's a great question, and that happens all the time. I like simple questions. So, I don't know, I might just ask them. That's, for example, in Germany, I'm sure you were told this often. I would just say, okay, that's really interesting. So where are your black professors? Where are, black leaders in commerce? Do you have any black journalists? In fact, where do people of colour work in Germany? I remember a conversation I had when I lived in Germany doing my doctoral studies, and I had a similar conversation. But this conversation reflected about who I was. So there was always this second question. In international environments, you always ask people where they're from. And whenever I said England, I would always have the second question, but where are you from really? And I'd say, well, yeah, really. I'm from England. And I remember an academic then said to me, okay, but you're, okay then, he said, you're half British. And I just looked at him, and we looked at each other. And we looked at each other, and, I didn't need to say that doesn't make any sense. That really doesn't make any sense. In English or German, that just doesn't make any sense. And we just left it. So sometimes just, a simple, quiet question will just cause that person to think. They don't need to tell you the answer. You don't need to waste your time trying to convince them. Just ask them a question and let them ruminate.
There's a question in the second row straight up.
I mean, just to continue, there is an important sense in which we have to care for ourselves and engage in these debates that are not going to really go anywhere because the person has made up their mind is something to be avoided.
Thank you. My name is Patricia Daly. I am a professor in the geography department, so I'm a geographer, not a lawyer. But I work on refugees, and I'm interested in the evolution of refugee law. And I've been really interested in the research that's been going on in archives at the moment, particularly work published on the debates and the negotiations that went on in the development of the 1951 Refugee Convention, and especially looking for race, doing that excavation work that you talked about. So I wondered whether a similar thing, and I haven't read your book either, so you probably have done it, but whether a similar exercise or research project has been done around the negotiations around the treaty, development of the Treaty of Rome, and whether, looking for colonial attitudes towards race, the colonies, and so on, because they must have been discussed. And that would be a way of really, finding out how, the European Union was, saw the colonies as part, and that, and issues around race. I don't know whether that's done. And also, following on from that, you said research has to be multidisciplinary. Do lawyers listen to historians or geographers or other scholars?
What do you mean? What are you trying to say about us lawyers? Of course. I mean, we have legal historians. Law is a diverse and multifaceted field. So yes, we're very keen, I think. I'm looking at my law colleagues around the room. I think I would say we're very open to multidisciplinary projects. So the projects that Shreya mentioned, for example, the Co-Power project, I'm working there with doctors, with social workers, with filmmakers, with sociologists, with political scientists. So yes, absolutely. In relation to your question, some of that work has been done. So there are documents that I found in the National Archives which do talk about the attitudes of the negotiators to migration from the colonies to Europe. And as you can imagine, it was something that was seen as less desirable, but became necessary because there wasn't enough migration from the southern regions of Europe. But there is definitely more that can be done. At the conference that I mentioned in Copenhagen, there were some scholars who were investigating Algerian relationship, how that changed with the European Union. So it is starting, but it is slow, and there's more definitely much more that can be done. But we need funding for it.
The lady at the far right corner.
Hi, I just had, I'm a first year PPES at Somerville. I had a question about like how this would probably tie into calls for reparatory or reconciliatory justice for colonialism and slavery, because I know in the past the EU has been extremely reluctant to acknowledge their part in like the underdevelopment of citizen post-colonial nations and not post-colonial nations. And there's been a renewed call for reparatory justice, especially last year with Barbados becoming a republic. And I just wanted to know how this would all tie in together with that, because obviously I don't, as far as I know, the EU is still not very open to entertaining conversations about reparations for slavery and colonialism, much less actually doing anything to give reparations.
Yeah. Thank you. So I think that would fall into the my section on correction, really, and action to correct previous wrongs. I mean, as I said, the European Union, we talk about the Commission, we talk about the Parliament, and we talk about all of these European Union institutions, but ultimately, the people who sit in those institutions and make decisions are representatives of the member states. And without the agreement of those member states, the European Union itself, per se, can't take any action. So I wonder, the European Union is a good forum to try to get agreement on reparations, but I wonder if really focusing on the member states might be the more effective way to go, because they are the ones that will ultimately be sitting in the European Union institutions to authorise any action of reparation. So they're really setting the policy. But at the same time, of course, there would be some merit in discussing it with the European Union and letting the European Union know about new ideas, new strategies, etc. But the decision makers are clearly the member states.
Joy.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for a very informative and very warm and generous talk. I really appreciate that, but also picking up on what you're saying about having to take care of yourself. And I would like to know how the European Union can actually have conversations whereby people who are having to face this denial, which is at a cost, how they actually support them. Because within speaking about things like this, there is a cost. It's a cost just to stand still. And what's happening in conversations around the Black community is exhaustion, where they say, I don't want to have another conversation with somebody who is denying my reality. So I wonder whether maybe, as you were saying, the interdisciplinary nature is a way that we really need to look at, because colonialism was interdisciplinary, it affects the arts,
That's right.
as well as manufacture, history books, just everything, music, everything. And what role do you think the arts maybe has to play in this? Thank you.
Thank you. So 2 questions there, both really important. Starting with the arts, I think the arts has a really important role to play, and I told you earlier about the film and the documentary that we produced as part of CoPower, because I think using artistic media can help to open a conversation in a non-threatening way, and can help to bring issues to the fore. When you bring issues to the fore using an image, that can be much more powerful than using words. So I really think use of the arts has a very important role to play. In terms of what the European Union can do, what it is doing at the moment is providing us with data. So Eurobarometer data, or data collected by the Fundamental Rights Agency that I mentioned, that data is there for us to use. The problem is we're not using it. And going back to Chu's question, that's another thing that we have to be more strategic about, is using the data that exists to challenge denial. And as I say, it's there. We can also try to be more active in using the Court of Justice. So there is a law protecting from discrimination, racial discrimination in the European Union, but it's very rarely used. Even when we were members, we didn't really use it, and now, of course, we can't. But there are still organisations in other parts of the European Union that could bring litigation forward to try to gain some traction and try to use law to protect as well.
Any final questions? So if there is one.
I think this is a short and easy question.
Okay.
Yeah, I just would like to hear if you have any insight about education and mental health of the Black population itself, because one thing that I see is that to have actions like the ones that you described, we do need people with a different mind and even a very strong support of the Black community to see them in action. So we need leaders. And then I just think okay, let's thinking about Oxford, where Oxford creates so many leaders all over the place. But first of all, to be in Oxford, you have to convince yourself that you deserve, that you are good enough, while your whole life you were treated as a second-class person. So it's really is there something on your platform that the European Union could help in terms of education and mental health of the Black population?
Yeah, that's not a quick question, but a really good question. Yeah, that's a really good question. So in terms of technicalities, and this is something that hampered the European Union in responding to the COVID pandemic. Health is really not something that the European Union, an area where the European Union can take action, not formally and not without the authorization of the member states. But having said that, where there's a will, there's a way. So the European Commission can design programs that the member states then sign up to or opt into. So, for example, if you think about the Schengen visa, that was a voluntary initiative created by the European Union that the member states signed up to. So it would be possible for the European Union to do something in relation to racial justice and mental health as well. Nice idea, thank you.
Any other quick questions that you don't want to take home? If there are no more questions, then Iyiola, it's really time to thank you once again for providing us sustenance. We're so deprived of hearing meditative lectures on what decolonization means, especially in the context of law and other powerful spaces. So this is really sustenance, and so much fodder to be taking into the new academic year. Thank you so much for joining us today at Kellogg, and thank you also on behalf of Decolonizing the Law Discussion Group.
Thank you.